James O'Brien.
Hello.
This is a strange mashup.
I'm in the other chair.
You're in the other chair, and this is me, Emily Maitlis, interviewing you, James O'Brien, about your book on your show.
Yeah.
So technically, I am asking the questions.
Yes.
But in reality, I guess anything that you don't like doesn't make the cut.
Oh, I'd like to make it clear you can be as rude and as vile as you want. I won't make any. No, absolutely not.
Okay. So these are the sort of ground rules that we thought we'd lay out for anyone listening to understand this sort of strange moment where we're coming together on full disclosure. But we're going to talk about how they broke Britain. Already a Sunday Times bestseller. Go on, you can show off. It was number 3 last time I looked.
4, I think, in the Sundays. It won't be sustained indefinitely, but we're delighted, obviously, with that. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Britney Spears, Billy Connolly, and me.
At least it's not the air fryer book.
Well, they decimated all of the charts for quite. They now have their own separate category. The top 10 air fryer books get their own section.
I don't think there's longevity in the air fryer personally.
Well, no,
that's for another debate.
Exactly.
So I guess the question I'd want to start with is when this stopped being a rant and became a book. A lot of what you do on your show comes from the place, I think, of anger. Right? It feels like there's anger in this. And the book is an angry book, isn't it? I mean, it's not. It's an incredible read.
Thank you.
But it's an angry book, and I guess.
Yes, it is an angry book.
I'm interested. I mean, you call it a charge sheet of poor behaviour and bad actors, and then you do what so few people do: you name and shame. You actually name your actors and you shame them, and you recite things from the past that many of us actually either didn't know or forgot about.
Yes, that's the important bit, isn't it? Is because it's not a rant. The introduction possibly has moments of ranting, but I do a lot of ranting, and there's a place and a time for ranting. But this is about explaining, actually, how an ecosystem was created in which the stuff that makes me angry could happen. So it's a bit chicken and egg. The idea that we have become a country, it's a very British, but it's very much about the UK. How we have become a country where, I suppose most obviously Brexit could happen, but then how could Boris Johnson become Prime Minister? How could Liz Truss become Prime Minister? How could Liz Truss's economic incompetence be inflicted upon the country in such a catastrophic way? How could Suella Braverman tell a Holocaust survivor to essentially be quiet when a Holocaust survivor asked her to moderate the sort of languages she uses about refugees, because it makes the Holocaust survivor think of the language that the Nazis used when they were murdering her family? All of these things that would once have been utterly abnormal have been rendered normal. So I need to list the abnormalities, but the central thrust of the book, and the reason why it goes a bit further than ranting, is to understand the conditions that have been put in place that allowed all this really crazy stuff to happen.
And do you think you do understand it? I mean, when you get to the end, do you end up thinking that that's why that happened? That's how we let these things happen?
I don't have a fully satisfactory sense of why they did it, because it's not like there's some sort of master plan in place or
a Nadine Dorries plot.
No, there's no. Well, yes. So I don't have that, but I do know how it happened. I do. When you see the 3 engines of transformation all operating in the same space, and then you look at where we ended up. I can't even say where we ended up, but where we had ended up when I wrote the book, which, I was still writing it in the middle of August, which is a astonishing turnaround by Penguin. But I had to be, because every day something would happen that needed to be in it. So the how of it is there, but not perhaps the why of it. I'm still not entirely clear on how much of it is done in expectation of the result that they've achieved. I think, for example, when you're pushing back against regulation, as in the opposite of what Jacob Rees-Mogg is always banging on about, you're not doing it in expectation of the opposition falling over. You never thought you were going to be in complete control. You never thought you were going to get into Downing Street. You just needed a constant tension between wanting businesses to be free to do whatever they want in the pursuit of profit, and then having a state or a government that actually does intervene in the hope, a sort of Keynesian hope of stability, of having some sort of stability. And I don't know that they ever actually dreamt of the day when
the guardrails were good.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly. Or even if they wanted it.
So you've got about, what, is it 10 people?
10 people.
What was the criteria to make it onto the list then?
So there's these three things. There is the right-wing media, which in this country is insane, and yet we're all so used to it we don't really realise. And when you do what we do for a living, unless you're very, very careful, you end up knocking about with these people. Some of them are lovely. I could have ended up, who knows where, if things had fallen differently. But when you see it in isolation, when you step back from it, the Mail in particular, the Murdoch press, and latterly the Telegraph, have become obnoxious. They have become deeply damaging to public discourse and to public unity, and oddly to the national interest, in the sense of what that means to the average voter, to the average person. So that's sort of engine one. Engine two would be the Tory party, which has been very much remoulded in the style of Nigel Farage. That's, again, linked to what the media have done. But the idea of Nick Griffin, the former leader of the British National Party, appearing on Question Time and the whole country having a fit of the vapours, whereas now Nigel Farage is appearing on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, when in fact they're ideologically interchangeable people. They're like two karaoke singers with the same backing track and the same song, but one's really good at singing. That's the only real difference.
You wouldn't draw any line between the ideologies of the BNP and Nigel Farage from UKIP?
Not really, no. I mean, certainly not on record as well, when you see what Farage was saying and doing and who he was knocking about with in his earlier days, and some of the stuff that he's come out with subsequently as a public figure. The associations with Alex Jones, Infowars, long after Alex Jones had accused the Sandy Hook families of being fakers and liars and actors.
And having to pay whatever it was, 50 billion.
Hundreds of millions of pounds. But Farage appeared on that programme 6 times, largely after the terrible stuff had happened. Comments he's made about the Jewish lobby, testimony from people who were at school with him about the kind of stuff he used to shout. So as individuals, perhaps even more than as figureheads of two different institutions, as individuals, I think they're interchangeable ideologically. But one of them can go on light entertainment programmes, whereas one of them, because he wasn't very good at being clubbable and affable on television, when he did Question Time, his career ended. So the Tory party...
Well, to be fair, it didn't end with Question Time. It ended because they got into trouble with their finances, I think.
Yes, but his hopes of hitting the mainstream and sanitising the British National Party were essentially ended when the dog saw the rabbit on that Question Time appearance. And the Tory party has been remoulded in that image. So it's lurched to the right. People like Braverman demonstrate. And then Farage pops up at conference sitting in the front row of Liz Truss's exculpatory sort of performance. And something I don't think even a year ago, when I started thinking about the book, I would have thought would happen. He's there on the dance floor, literally jumping up and down with Priti Patel.
But I asked you about the criteria, and I guess the criteria for breaking Britain is what? What do you charge them with?
And then the third thing, as we'll get onto, is the lobby groups that masquerade as think tanks. So the division, that you couldn't achieve any of these things unless the country had been set at each other's throats, largely over the issue of immigration, or actually the issue of foreigners, whether it's foreigners apparently acting against our interests under the European Union aegis, or whether it's too many foreigners coming here, or whether it's foreigners in dinghies, or foreigners driving buses, or foreigners running institutions, running the NHS, whatever it is. So we've been turned into a sort of nativist versus anti-nativist population that has done immeasurable amounts of damage, and that's the chief way in which the Tory party has undergone a process of Faragification, and that is one of the ways in which you create the environment in which Boris Johnson can then get elected Prime Minister with a massive majority, by promising to get Brexit done, an utterly meaningless, even fraudulent phrase. But by then we'd come to define ourselves so much by where we stood in that battle, that divide, that it got him over the line.
So I guess the differentiation I'm trying to understand is the characters in the book are mostly male, they're mostly right-wing.
Yeah.
You could have called this Why I Hate Tories, but it's not about policy, is it?
No.
It's not about, I mean, you've just given us the run of immigration and, if you like, xenophobia, but actually you're not talking about policies you don't like. You're talking about the manner in which trust is eroded,
yeah,
really.
And the direction of traffic as well. Trust is eroded. It's probably an even bigger part than the division, but I don't think you can have one with the other. So until you've really... So I've written a lot in the past about footballification, when you tie a scarf so tightly around your neck that it's cut off the flow of blood to your brain. And we're probably all a little bit guilty of that, but the people, 9 of the 10 chapters in this book are so guilty, or 8 of the 10, Cummings is quite interesting, 8 out of the 10 chapters in the book are almost defined by what they're opposed to rather than what they're in favour of. And once you're in that scenario, then the breakdown of trust becomes endemic. So one good example is Owen Paterson, who, again, doesn't stand out anymore. In normal times, a well-connected senior Tory busted by their own system of standards and scrutiny for doing something that's really very bad, being found to have lobbied on behalf of people, companies that were paying you money, is banged to rights. And the response of the people at the centre of what I'm writing about was not only to try to get him off the hook, but then to try to set fire to the rule book itself, so that he would somehow be rendered not guilty, because the rules don't apply. Yes, change the rules, lose the rules.
It's kind of where we are with Rwanda.
Well, it's exactly where we are with Rwanda. We'll pass legislation to make the world flat. We'll pass legislation to make the moon cheese. And that's where, when I was writing it, that's when I knew I was not going mad. Because, as you just did there, I talk about Owen Paterson and you talk about Rwanda. So the question becomes, well, what have they got in common? And what they have in common is a subversion of standards and an abandonment of objective reality, a belief that, and I think you could probably trace this back to Brexit and possibly beyond, we can make it so by believing enough. You remember when they were saying you just need to believe more,
optimism,
yes, all of that, and so that that brings in the division, and it brings in the subversion, it brings in the abandonment of truth, and it brings in the complete destruction of the relationship between actions and consequences. So I gave you Paterson. I could have given you Patel. The Prime Ministerial Advisor on Ministerial Standards concludes in writing, after a detailed investigation, that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is a bully. It would be a resignation issue, not even a question of it, in any previous administration. In Boris Johnson,
it was a resignation issue.
Well, of course it was a resignation issue.
But not for Priti Patel.
But not a resignation. Well, exactly. It was Alexander Allen that resigned in protest at Boris Johnson, not just even sitting on his hands, you remember, not just sort of saying, oh, well, that's all very sad and terrible and she'll do better in the future, but literally WhatsApping his gang, the same gang that would have been part of the Save Owen Paterson Society, and saying, let's form a square around the Pritzker. So if you're one of them, the rules no longer apply. And that's all the rules. It's not just the rules about ministerial standards. It's the rules about reality. It's the rules about parties. It's the rules about parliamentary contempt, parliamentary privilege. All of the rules have broken. They've gone. Partly as a consequence of this, of deliberate campaigns, and partly as a sort of crumbling. When you have morally dissolute people at the very top of the pyramid, at the very top of society, at top of government, you end up with Dominic Cummings lying about Barnard Castle, and you end up with Boris Johnson lying about parties.
And is that because the people that you're talking about never really thought the rules applied in the first place?
I think for some of them it is. We know that Johnson's teachers at Eton identified him as believing that the network of obligations that bind us all somehow don't apply to him. But I think what breaks is the system that had to keep defending him. So by becoming an embodiment of Brexit, Johnson put himself in a position where people like Paul Dacre, who gets a chapter, would do things that I don't think they would have done in any other circumstances. So by rights, Dacre should hate Johnson. And by many accounts, for a long time he did. But because they all had their brains boiled by Brexit, well, their brains had been boiled by jingoism and a sort of post-imperial bogus patriotism. But because Brexit and the fear of losing this prize became so acute, Dacre turns into a man that is defending and championing a sexually incontinent serial liar. Now, I think Dacre's a ridiculous figure, but his Daily Mail would...
He would have been a Theresa May.
He would have stood against sexual incontinence. He would have been hugely alienated by Johnson's moral dissolution, and yet he ends up championing it, defending it, even in the worst case scenarios, going after Keir Starmer for a curry when Johnson's behaviour was of an entirely different kind. And ultimately, and the bit that happened as I was approaching the end of the book, that again just made me go, crikey, it's possible you've gone from worrying that you've gone too far to worrying that you haven't gone far enough. Handing him £500,000 a year to write a column for the Daily Mail after he's found to have rode completely roughshod over one of the most basic presumptions, one of the most basic requirements of our parliamentary democracy, which is you don't deliberately lie to the House of Commons, whoever you are, let alone Prime Minister.
I'm going to start one chapter earlier than Paul Dacre with Rupert Murdoch, and you say the scale of damage done to democracy by one man's megalomania. And you raise the question of whether Murdoch believes what his media empire peddles. Do you think he does?
No, I don't. I don't think he does. And I write about people and things I find very interesting. So it's not really polemic, this one. It's a lot more. There's a lot of footnotes, isn't there? That's the point. There's an awful lot of evidence. It's got more footnotes than anything I've ever written before, because I'm fascinated by how things happened. And in Murdoch's case, what I am most fascinated by is the tension between the hugely successful businessman and the boy with journalism in his blood. And part of the reason why I'm fascinated by that is because I was a boy with journalism in my blood. Although my dad didn't own a newspaper, he wrote for one. And Murdoch, I think, arrived here doing sort of a big internship's not quite the right word, but on the Daily Express to really ink in his blood, ink in his veins. And over the course of this extraordinary career, the ink in his veins has been replaced with something else, and I'm interested in why. And there are various episodes in that chapter that help to answer that question. But perhaps the most significant is the Fox News moment when David Yelland, a former editor of The Sun, suggests that Roger Ailes, who was the sort of godfather of Fox News, came in and saw what the internet was going to do. They both understood that the internet was going to commoditize hatred in a way that we'd never seen before, even by the standards of the man that let Kelvin Mackenzie continue editing The Sun after Hillsborough. This was going to be a whole new level of bile and hatred, and they got in front of it. And for Yelland, who knows Murdoch much better than I ever will, that is when the final departure from the boy with ink in his blood was completed, because the prioritization of commercial success and profit, regardless of truth, regardless even of any pretense of the truth, and the peddling of hatred became the guiding star of his empire, rather than what previously could perhaps have been seen as a necessary evil.
You found, and I'd never heard of this, you found this panel discussion that Murdoch had done with Ben Bradley of the Washington Post in 1984, ironically.
Yes.
About the importance of the media.
Incredible.
Holding their line against the establishment, against those in authority. The press should be anti-establishment and keep its distance from authority, vested interests and big business. So at that point, and admittedly that was quite a while ago now.
Yeah, poignant though, right? I mean,
yes. At that point he believed that the best kind of press, the best media, the best journalism was the stuff that did not get into bed with authority. Yeah.
And even perhaps more interestingly, in some ways, it's part of a defence of the perceived liberal bias in the media, that those comments, because he points out that if you are anti-establishment, if you do question authority, if you're keen on speaking truth to power, if you have certain levels of education and certain levels of curiosity, then you are more likely to present as what we now call liberal. But Rupert Murdoch's defence of a perceived liberal bias in the media is the most compelling that I've ever seen or ever read. And that's the boy with the ink in his blood. That is him seeing people in power as organs that must be held to account, organs that the Fourth Estate must police.
And what I'm really interested by is not just the power that holds in the centre, but how those in political power prop him up, or he props them up. And it's always interesting that, isn't it? Not the central figure, but the acolytes.
Yes.
And even people who come in thinking they want to change the system, thinking that they're coming from a completely different political place to Murdoch, the Blairs and the Browns of this world, were still magnetised, that sort of centrifugal force, into the Murdoch world, where they had to go to the parties and they had to agree to things that they probably don't feel great
You're being very generous. You don't have to agree to be godfather if he asks you.
I've said no to a godparent.
Have you?
Yes, I have. I mean, it wasn't
Rupert Murdoch, and you weren't Prime Minister.
I have not been Prime Minister. It was not Rupert Murdoch. But I think anyway, my point is...
hang on. I'm interested. Did it end the friendship?
Yeah.
Okay.
It did.
All right. Well, there you go. So Tony Blair could have said no when Rupert and Wendy asked him to be godfather to their child. Sarah Brown.
But I'm going way back before. You are Blair, and you want to come into power.
Yeah.
And you're recognising that there hasn't been a Labour victory.
Yeah.
For your pretty much your whole life, and you might be the person who does it, and you have to say yes to Rupert Murdoch. Yes. Has anything changed in that? Do you think?
I don't think.
Do you think it's changed for Starmer now?
I think Starmer is keeping his distance more than Blair did. I've spoken to Blair about this, and it's one of the very few conversations I reference in the book, because he would simultaneously, in a very Blairy way, he'll simultaneously acknowledge the discomforting nature of the closeness of that relationship, and then in the same breath
wouldn't have done it any other way.
Argue that if you want to get into power, then you've got to do that. Miliband tried, didn't he? Miliband tried not only to keep his distance from Murdoch, but also to push back against the Daily Mail when they maligned the memory of his dead father. Starmer, as with so many things, so far seems to be plotting a peculiar path. He seems to be managing to keep stuff at bay while not embracing it with too much. I mean, he's not embracing it enthusiastically by any stretch of the imagination, and so far they haven't come for him. So I don't know what's going on behind the scenes.
I mean, do you think there is any correlation between Ed Miliband pushing back on Paul Dacre and him not getting into power? Most people would say he wasn't going to get into power anyway.
Well, you forget. I mean, Cameron certainly thought that Miliband was going to win in 2015. Most of the signs were that he would. I don't think so. I think that because that was such an individual episode, that was such a specific moment. They called his dad, for people who don't know, they called him the man who hated Britain. And Ed Miliband insisted on a right of reply, in which he explained his father was actually at D-Day as a refugee who'd found safety and security in Britain. And the Daily Mail did something that even now I struggle to quite get my head around. They printed Miliband's defence of his dead father, war hero father, to use the language of the Daily Mail, and they ran it alongside a doubling down on the original attack in both the editorial, I think, and in a second piece by Geoffrey Levy, who'd written the original article. And as I explain in the book, in the context of standards and consistency, you have to point out that when Ed Miliband's dad was at D-Day, the father of the man that owns the Daily Mail was 4 years previously writing love letters to Adolf Hitler. So this idea that the newspaper has any right whatsoever to offer up sententiousness or moral judgment on anybody, let alone on politicians, is palpably absurd, and yet it's completely embedded in every level of our society. No, I don't think that Miliband would have become Prime Minister if he hadn't pushed back against the Daily Mail. But I do wonder what would happen if any of them actually took up cudgels, especially now with the numbers diminishing. Blair had no choice. It's a very different world from 1997. You don't need, I don't think you need them. Work on the principle that they're going to attack you, whatever it is that you do. If you're Keir Starmer, look at the curry business in Durham and try and find a way of not only getting your message out via different means now and platforms, but attack them like I attack them in the book. Tell the people how badly they're being served by these influence informers.
Keir Starmer's dropped any pledge to bring out Leveson 2.
He has, but he's still looking at non-dom legislation, which is a huge finger to the Daily Mail in particular, less so Murdoch. And I wouldn't rule out Leveson 2. He's dropped pledges to almost everything, because I think he wants to start as Prime Minister with a relatively clean slate and not being held hostage to anything. But I mean, I would have thought that Leveson 2 would be a brilliant way, once you're in power, of exerting some of the pressure that I just tried to describe.
Do you think that the press has more power currently in this country than the political class?
Yeah, way more. Has done for a while. Has done, I mean, it'd be hard to put a point on it, wouldn't it? Whether it's Mackenzie talking about phoning up John Major and threatening to empty a bucket of shit over his desk, although, to be fair, John Major says he has no memory of that ever happening, and I know which of those two men I'd trust. But that idea of the tail wagging the dog, definitely. And the bit which I still find hard to believe, and which wouldn't have come out without Leveson, when Rebecca Brooks was sending messages to David Cameron saying, I can't wait to start working together. Now, how from that, I know that you're aware of this, it's why you picked up on it earlier, but for people who aren't in the business, that 1984 panel with Ben Bradley when he's offering up an almost romantic...
I mean, Ben Bradley is the Watergate editor,
yeah, exactly,
right? If there's
that.
one person who sort of stands for
Yes.
taking on authority and winning, it's Ben Bradley.
And they wouldn't agree on much else, but Murdoch is there in 84 offering up that almost dewy-eyed defence of proper journalism, and then by the time that David Cameron is preparing his first conference speech as Tory leader, he's getting private messages off the head of Rupert Murdoch's representative on Earth, saying, I can't wait to start working together, and gossipy exchanges about his wife, and the difference, the journey there between where Murdoch wanted to be and where we've all ended up is absolutely remarkable. It really is.
So if that's Murdoch, who you think doesn't really believe what his papers push, you say that Dacre is a different kind of beast because he's ideologically sort of compelled to print this stuff. And yet you also say he's a man who's terrified of scrutiny. I mean, we know that's true. You know, I'm sure we've all asked Paul Dacre for interviews over the course of many years. Why, if you were a true believer, do you think you would be scared of that scrutiny then?
Because you're a pathetic coward who truly believes that the whole world is against you. And therefore, you're not going to put your head in the lion's mouth. You're not going to expose yourself to scrutiny, because the thing you're most terrified of, ultimately, is what a pathetic coward you are. I'm not remotely confused by this. Dacre has to construct a world. Projection as a psychological phenomenon is always fascinating, because, you know, whether you're a bully or a coward or both, the idea that you need to believe that the whole world is just as craven as you are must be such a driving force. Dacre, for reasons I don't know, but he arrives at adulthood terrified of everything, terrified of foreigners, terrified of working women, terrified of sexual autonomy, terrified of the European Union, terrified of pretty much everything under the sun. And in order not to feel and look terrified, he has to make everybody as frightened of exactly the same things that he is as he can. And he has succeeded. He has managed to remould much of Middle England in the guise of a frightened white man who has never really lived anywhere near immigrants, but is absolutely convinced that if he had to, it would be the end of civilization as he knows it. So the scrutiny would come with the knowledge deep down that it's not true. That deep down, it's like a mirror. You know, you hold up a mirror in front of Paul Dacre, and he would run a mile rather than look in it.
And if he said, "I'm reflecting," because that is what we hear. I am reflecting what people around the country think but don't dare say out loud, and my paper is the only place that will print it, and you don't understand that.
Yeah, well, Farage would say exactly the same thing. I'm sick to death of hearing about the silent majority, who are neither silent nor a majority. If you read in your newspaper every morning, and loads of people have experienced this, loads of people in America whose parents and grandparents watch Fox News have experienced exactly the same thing as well. If you are being told constantly to be terrified, constantly to be enraged, you're under constant threat, you're under constant attack, they're coming for your jobs, they're coming for your freedoms, they're coming for your culture, they're coming for your school places, they're coming for your doctor's appointments, they're coming for this, they're coming for that. Don't specify who they is, really, not in any particular detail. Just dress it up as lefties and foreigners or liberals, and constantly an unleavened diet of that. Then of course 5-10 years down the line you're going to have a legion of people who are enraged and frightened of all the things you've told them to be. You don't live in the home counties in relative comfort, in financial security, and end up terrified of Brussels unless someone has very, very deliberately told you to be and given you bogus reasons why you should be.
So do you think that the Dacreisation of the Mail is completely permanent now, because he hasn't been the editor for 6-7 years now,
no, but he's still editor-in-chief.
He is,
and the current executives are all very much his men.
I guess what I'm saying is, do you think a paper can ever change.
Yes, I think it did. I think it changed. The most interesting bit in that unwritten bit of that chapter is Geordie Gregg's tenure as editor of the Daily Mail. Now, look, my full-on lefty mates get quite impatient with me when I offer up defences of Geordie Gregg. The Mail didn't turn overnight into, a cuddly, loving, warm place, but it was very, very different from the paper that Paul Dacre had edited, and no one was more angry or aware of that than Paul Dacre. And so, yes, you can turn oil tankers around, and you can do so without.
But presumably, it lost money.
It didn't commercially suffer. It was. I think they slowed the decline, which is all that any national newspaper editor can do now. It definitely had nothing to do with circulation figures when Northcliffe decided to defenestrate Geordie Gregg, to everybody's surprise. But it did happen shortly after, I think it was the Patterson episode, when Geordie Gregg had made, as editor of the Mail, had made it very clear that they would not be fluffing Boris Johnson in the way that the paper did previously and has done subsequently. They would actually be holding the feet to the fire. And remember, Gregg is of that world. Geordie went to Eton. Dacre, like a lot of grammar school boys or scholarship boys or minor public school boys, very, very chippy. He's simultaneously enthralled to the true possessors of privilege and very, very threatened by them. Geordie Gregg wouldn't be impressed or threatened by Boris Johnson, not by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that probably had more to do with the end of his editorship than anything else.
There's a lot of Vote Leave characters in the book, Matthew Elliott, Dominic Cummings, and there's a chapter on Andrew Neil, Spectator chairman and champion of many of the loudest Brexit voices in his magazine and elsewhere, whose presence at the BBC for many years you call out as pretty problematic in the impartiality debate.
I think so. I've been interviewed by 2 or 3 former national newspaper editors about the book. I've had no coverage at all in newspapers. It's quite not remotely remarkable, but people who've been very powerful in newspapers very keen to talk about it, which shows that it is interesting. But the newspapers won't print proper reviews of it or anything like that, because it would involve them having to report the critique of their industry that's in there. And the Andrew Neil chapter is the one that they perhaps are most interested in as well. For me, he does 3 things, and you've asked about one of them, which is what he represents with regard to the BBC. So your story is well known. The story I tell in the book in more detail is Oscar Bentley's story, this 25-year-old fact-checker who did his first shift on Politics Live and woke up the next morning to find himself in the Sun, the Express, the Mail and the Telegraph, possibly the Times, but definitely those 4, because they had discovered, if that's the right word, that when he was a student at York University a few years previously, he had, among other terrible offences, he'd uploaded a picture of his pet to a Facebook page called Dogs for Jeremy Corbyn. And in the ecosystem I describe in the book and the intersection of the newspaper world with the BBC world, this is proof that he should not be working at the BBC. It's proof that the BBC is biased. It's proof that the BBC is full of fifth columnists dedicated to promoting lefty ideologies. And this is a 25-year-old fact-checker on Politics Live. Andrew Neil had been publishing, as you say, rabidly pro-Brexit columnists. He'd been publishing Islamophobia.
You said rabidly pro-Brexit.
No, you're quite right. Brexit I beg your pardon. You did, but pro-Brexit voices. He'd definitely been publishing Nazi apologism from at least one columnist. The Islamophobia in those pages has been picked up on by better qualified people than me. The writers that he's championed have migrated into the Murdoch media and beyond with their curious relationship with truth. Rod Liddell just this weekend writing statistically utterly nonsensical stuff about Suella Braverman being popular in the north. The co-opting of the working class by middle class writers essentially promoting racism all happened on Andrew Neil's watch, and somehow he never fell foul of the BBC's impartiality rules. And another example I give, who again, I'm not in any way questioning his journalism, but if Oscar Bentley isn't fit for purpose at the BBC, then Nick Robinson, the presenter of the Today programme, a former chair of the Macclesfield Young Conservatives, a former chair of the Cheshire Young Conservatives, the Oxford University Conservative Association, and the Young Conservatives themselves can hold his position and do it very well without any criticism from anywhere, because there's no balancing equivalent to the rabid right-wing newspapers attacking a 25-year-old fact checker or attacking you. There's no equivalent to that, saying, well, hang on a minute, this bloke couldn't be more Tory as a student, and no one ever questions his suitability to do the job. Amol on the Today programme, again, not a criticism of his work at all, spent several years as Evgeny Lebedev's bagman in London, his sort of facilitator. And
he was the editor of The Independent, wasn't he?
But before that, he was the bloke that was making Lebedev's introductions into society and acting as a form of factotum before he became editor of The Independent. It was a proper role, really, for a news desk executive on The Independent at the time after he bought it. So it's just that, and I'm not going to bend over backwards to exonerate these individuals of criticism. I'm not accusing them of anything. I'm using them as examples of how bent the overall system is. With another example being your colleague on newsagents, Lewis Goodall, who found himself in the ridiculous position of being told frequently that Robbie Gibb, who's a board member at the BBC, had marked his card, and Gibb by this point was trying to lecture Newsnight staff on what impartiality was. And Lewis turns around and points out quite correctly that it's a bit rum for a former student officer in the Erdington Labour Party, or whatever august position it was that Lewis held, getting lectures on impartiality from a bloke that was Theresa May's Director of Communications literally 10 minutes ago.
So where do you think that blind spot comes from then?
Fear. The BBC's blind spot. Fear. An understandable fear, because, you and me and Lewis, our job entails having our head above the parapet, and some of the pot shots that you have endured from the Mail. And Lewis has come in for as well, and myself on a much smaller scale, because I wasn't at the BBC either permanently or very long. They're not nice, but we kind of take it, the rough with the smooth. It's when you feel that the BBC management is letting you down that the real problems come in, and that comes from fear. So that comes from a fear of them having a picture of their house in the Mail tomorrow, or their neighbours suddenly going, oh crikey, I saw you in the they're frightened, I think, of being attached to these bogus victimhood stories, the bogus allegation, and they take it all too seriously. So you get a complaint about whether it's a Newsnight monologue, or whether it is a complaint from government about a Newsnight monologue, or a complaint from some two-bit columnist about a perceived bias in a presenter on a programme. You know how the system works at the BBC. It was designed for a different era, when complaints were made in good faith and when people were protecting, if you like, the reputation of the BBC. But now these complaints aren't made in good faith. These accusations aren't real. When I was presenting Newsnight, I took a phone call once from the editor asking me to take down a tweet that I'd done. And I said, not again. This is as I was getting to the end of my personal rainbow. And I said, well, who's complained about it? And the editor said, Toby Young is complaining about it on Twitter, and I'm getting some noise from upstairs. I said, if the BBC is worrying about Toby Young's Twitter account, then we've got a much, much bigger problem on our hands than anything I've done.
And do you think the BBC genuinely feels that it is institutionally too liberal? I mean, do you think with a let's imagine a Starmer government, do you think it still fights that same battle because it thinks in its blood it is institutionally, too metropolitan or too liberal or too urban or whatever?
It's a good question.
Or does it just need to please whoever is in government?
I don't think. I mean, can we talk about the BBC as a homogenous entity? We probably can. It's sort of the closer you get to the very top, the more likely it is that you can speak in those terms. There's two possibilities. One is that we've all been gaslit, and that they are worried because they keep seeing, in almost every newspaper in the country, they keep seeing that they are. So therefore there must be some truth in it. And then recently departed bigwigs will always go to one of the right-wing newspapers and confirm Paul Dacre's fever dreams and write about how actually, yes, everyone was anti-Brexit or everybody was liberal. So possibly they're trying to compensate for a bias that may not even exist at all. You don't see any evidence of bias in news coverage. I don't believe you do. As a consumer of the BBC, you don't see any bias of any evidence of bias in coverage, but that possibly they think they need to really work hard to prove that there isn't any. And that's what breaks my heart, because you can't. It's like a bottomless chasm into which they keep throwing effort, and individuals even, because they think that they're dealing with rational operators who one day would go, oh yes, okay, we're going to change our view now, we're going to stop attacking the BBC because they've got rid of so-and-so, and so-and-so doesn't want to be there anymore, and they've done this, and they've got all of these people on there, what you've described as the Minford paradigm. They've loaded up all their programmes with supremely unqualified or underqualified people who do not offer a counterbalance to the person on the other side of the argument, but we pretend that they do, and they're going to do all of this, and eventually Murdoch and Dacre are going to turn around and say, do you know what, I think it's time we laid off the BBC now.
So they don't really realise the commercial interests that are underlying that.
They are dedicated to the destruction of the BBC. They hate it for a variety of reasons, not least it's a platform for dissent, but more than that, there are tons of money swishing around, of which none is making its way into their pockets.
Let's look at last week. You probably could have written another two chapters,
every day,
right?
Yeah.
As we speak, David Cameron is becoming a lord, and he's got a Ukraine trip already under his belt, 3 days in. You called his leadership catastrophic, his campaign a catalogue of missteps and miscalculations. And you quote an economist, Timo Fetzer.
Yes.
Who links the Brexit vote and the austerity measures.
University of Warwick. I saw that you tweeted that the other day, and I saw some people thinking, oh, look at these centrists, oh, they're so shocked by it. But of course, the reason it's in the book and the reason why you tweeted it is because of the rigour of the research that Fetzer has done here, the quality of the research that he set up. The thing about academic research, unlike bloody newspaper columns, is you really have to show you're working, and he's tracked every step of the relationship between austerity hitting and UKIP support rising, and that's fascinating, because no one ever talks about this, least of all David Cameron. But the idea that people voted for Brexit because they had run out of patience with what was happening around them is obvious. What's new in that research, or was new to me, the Financial Times have explored similar territory around the same time, was how clear it was. How clear the relationship was. So Cameron, by bringing in austerity, created an older generation of disillusioned people who felt that they could vote somehow to just reject the status quo. It's not a million miles away from what we've seen in Argentina this week. You're not voting for anything, you're voting just to stop the current stuff. Stop it. Make it stop. It's all awful. And he'd created a lot of the awfulness with austerity, and then watched on confused when lots of people voted for change without being able to tell you necessarily what that change was. Everybody, Cummings understood this, and callers to my radio show understood this, some from the point of being in this cohort, in this constituency of people, and some from the point of knowing it because their parents were in it or their friends were in it. They just voted to break the status quo. And leaving the European Union had become, correctly by that point, such a big thing that breaking that bond was so attractive to so many people because of the state of their lives when they were living in that bond, when they were living in that union. Of course, the great tragedy subsequently is that the membership of the European Union had absolutely nothing to do with the state of their lives. And if it did, it was probably a positive force rather than a negative one. But that's all on Cameron, and no one ever touches him with it.
So the economist Fetzer basically says that had those welfare cuts not happened, then the country wouldn't have voted Brexit?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot, isn't it, to rest on one specific policy in one specific government?
Of course it is. And you know, you can't bet the house on it, but you can remind yourself how small that margin was at the time, what a tiny number of people. And that's not the only thing in the book that talks about a counterfactual or how things could have been. I'd also throw in the amount of money that Dominic Cummings spent in the final weekend on Facebook adverts, tailored very specifically to tell your Auntie Doris that if she voted Brexit, then she'd be able to have a new hit by Christmas. Almost word for word, actually. Some of those adverts were so specific and so carefully tailored and carefully directed at people that without all of the elements of the ecosystem that I describe in the book, it wouldn't have happened. And that is, under that reading by that academic, that is one of the most compelling pieces of the jigsaw.
As we speak,
It's a busy day. It's a busy day.
But we assume Nigel Farage is asleep somewhere in Australia, trying to forge a financial comeback or a PR comeback.
Who knows, really?
How do you boycott? I mean, this was trending last night. Yeah. Boycott I'm a Celeb. Does that... I mean, do you think that works for people who don't want to give him the time of day?
I don't know, actually. I haven't got involved in that. I note that the numbers are down markedly on last year. They're down, I think, 2.2 million on last year. But that might not all. That is definitely not all on him. It could be a variety of reasons. I, for example, couldn't wait to tune in to see Matt Hancock, but I certainly won't be tuning in to see Nigel Farage.
So why? Go on, just explain why.
Well, for two reasons. I already know how awful he is, so I'm not going to tune in the hope of seeing him prove how awful he is.
Why did you tune in to Matt Hancock then?
Because I couldn't quite believe his front. I didn't have a proper handle on Matt Hancock, really. I fell for his shtick a bit. I think I was desperate to believe that there was somebody sensible in that room, dominated by Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings in the COVID.
Not in Australia.
Yes, exactly. And I just wanted to see behind the curtains, really, with Hancock. But I know exactly what Farage is made of, and I certainly don't want to watch him. I love this phrase that someone's come up with called fun washing. I certainly don't want to see him fun washing a truly toxic demeanour, and that is the big danger. You know, it so much depends on the edit. ITV really get to choose what people see, not Nigel Farage, and
do you think they will be swayed by the sort of the clamour or the outcry or the boycott this, or not at all?
I don't know. I honestly think that so much now is about clicks and counting. I think almost everyone seems to have given up on any notion of what Rupert Murdoch described in 1984. And I know light entertainment isn't journalism, but any notion among providers of content to have responsibility towards your audience seems to have disappeared. You know, the bloody Andrew Tate's back on one of those tiny little programmes later today, designed entirely just to get social media clicks and trending hashtags and brouhaha, and nobody really seems to care about what it might be doing to consumers.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that. So you're saying, I know light entertainment isn't journalism, and I guess there'll be some people trying to work you out in this, James, which is like, blimey, how do you carry this around the whole time? Like, how do you carry around, famously, you know about Richard Tice, you will not shake his hand, you say to his face, I can't remember what you said to his face, kind of fuck off, wasn't it?
It wasn't kind of.
Yeah. So do you check the background of everyone before you...
No, I know him. I mean, he's Farage's ex-butler, isn't he? And now leader of the same party.
I guess the question is...
I'm quite fun at parties, Emily.
I'm not. So I speak as somebody who's really antisocial, trying to work out how you muster your way through life a bit, I suppose.
Well, there's people pouring poison into the ears of people who don't deserve it. So the phrase that I'm proudest of, for all the bloody phrases I've come up with over the years, is contempt for the conmen, compassion for the conned. People who profit from poisoning not just public discourse, but family relationships. You know, people who profit either in terms of power and influence or cold hard cash. It's not hard. It's not a desperately long list. There wasn't a huge waiting list of people to get into the book. I found the 10 I wanted, and they really selected themselves. I just really have a problem with people who make everything worse for everybody else in order to make things temporarily better for themselves. I just think it's such an unpleasant and lazy and cruel and unthinking way to live that I don't have that much difficulty identifying who they are and how I choose to treat them.
Do you worry that their presence in a book like this kind of martyrs them? That they can go, oh, were you on the James O'Brien hit list? Oh, badge of honour. You've got, your rogues gallery.
I'd be happy with that. But I think the fact that they're all furiously ignoring it suggests that they're not very happy to be in it. I mean, if the book had disappeared without trace, I'd be feeling a bit silly now. But the book has done very well, and the people in it are now much better known and will continue to be when the paperback comes out and when more and more people have read it. Everything in there, all the receipts are there. All of the evidence is there. The speeches that Dacre gave when he used the phrase cultural Marxism, surely cognizant of its anti-Semitic connotations, the history to Rupert Murdoch getting his hands on the Times, the detail of what Andrew Neil did to the Institute of Economic Affairs in terms of affording it credibility at a time when it was peddling underclass rhetoric and calling for single mothers to have their children taken away. Matthew Elliott getting a free pass at the BBC from Laura Kuenssberg 2 weeks before the verdict that he was in the studio to poo-poo and dismiss was actually formally delivered by the Electoral Commission. Every chapter really, Farage's history, which we've touched on already, Cummings's absurd life story, culminating in this ludicrous brief stranglehold upon the leadership of the country. Truss being in the words of a Tory commentator, turning Downing Street into an incubator for the Institute of Economic Affairs, and the head of that daft institution masquerading as an academic authority, replying with a sunglasses emoji before ending up on her honours list for a while. I think he's been taken off it again now. I mean, it's all there. It's all there. It's all written down.
And if you're talking to students of journalism coming through, the next generation, what is your advice, or what do you want to see when these people are in front of the camera or in front of the microphone? I mean, how much of this back history do you have to go into every time you introduce somebody to do an interview?
That's a really good question, and I'm spared that because I don't really do interviews anymore. So I get, in a way, it's a bit of a free pass that I can give myself. Sophie Ridge did a really good one the other day with Claire Coutinho when she just wouldn't let the meat tax nonsense pass. I don't think you need to go into history. I don't know what you're like. I sometimes, when I was doing interviews, it's a bit like playing football. And I'd just see the pass open up ahead of me, and I'd have it in the back of my mind, which isn't normal. Maybe that's what you were referring to when you talked about carrying it all through life. I do have quite a lot of stuff filed away. When I interviewed Farage a few years ago, even I was slightly surprised about what I managed to remember about the makeup of Italian fascists and stuff like that. And when he said something about one, I knew he was talking about a different one. That's maybe not normal. But you see the pass open up in front of you, and you might just say something like, well, that's quite a departure from where we were last year. Jim Pickard picked up on it today, the Financial Times deputy political editor, who didn't get the chance to ask Rishi Sunak a question, but probably because they knew that if he had a chance, he'd have asked something like this, which was, this time last year, Prime Minister, you insisted that rising inflation had absolutely nothing to do with the government. So now that it's falling, how can the same government be taking credit for it? Just things like that. You don't have to be pulling out their old school reports. But I guess if it's pertinent to what they're saying today, then pull it out of the archive, pull it out of the memory bank. If they're giving an interview about hospitals and they used to be Secretary of State for Defence, then there's no point hitting them over the head with stuff that's got nothing to do with what they're announcing today. But that inflation example is perfect. If they're talking about inflation and they appear to have undertaken a 180-degree turn on the role that they play in inflation, then hit them over the head with that. And the thing I'm not in a position to teach anyone much, but the thing I don't think we see enough of is the repetition, not in the Paxman way, in the Michael Howard interview, which just went to really weird places, but just not letting them move on until they've answered the question, or until they've accounted for it, or until you can say, well, you're clearly never going to answer that question, and I shall let the listener or the viewer decide what that means.
And if a question isn't answered, would you just end the interview there?
I think ultimately that would be the nuclear move. But I think that better interviewers than me have found ways of parking that. You do it, Michelle Hussein does it. Everybody listening, everybody watching knows what's happened there. You don't have to. If you end the interview, I think you run the risk of making it about yourself rather than the subject. And if I have a failing,
Go on, say it out loud.
I possibly would lean a little further than others to being tempted to make it about myself. But hopefully the fact that I can say that out loud means that I'm already in the process of working on it. But but you would, wouldn't you? If you end an interview as a journalist with a politician, it's a very me thing to do. Whereas you could just say, well, I've asked you 17 times, I've asked you 8 times, everybody listening will understand this question and they will see now that you're not answering it, but we'll move on. I've done that in the past. It's probably more effective than chucking them out of the studio. Also, you've got producers in the gallery go, what are we going to do for the next 8 minutes?
We can't go to a break yet.
Can't believe you've chucked them out.
Get them back.
Yes.
On that bombshell, James O'Brien, we're going to leave it.
Thank you, Emily Maitlis.
I mean, is that right? I suppose you can tell me if I'm going to leave it here because it's your show.
No, it's not. It's for one night only. It's your show.
I'm your guest.
Did you like the bits about you?
In the book?
Yeah.
I read them between my fingers.
Yeah.
Actually. Because you always sort of start palpitating. You think, oh my God, is this going to be, am I going to have to explain?
No.
It's funny, isn't it, how much explaining we still feel that we need to do about our own moves and comments, and I don't think you ever get over that.
No, maybe not.
Yeah, it was very good.
But I thought that there were 2 or 3 things you've done in recent years that were very important and very central to the thrust of the book, and things that were done to you as well that prove some of the points that I'm trying to make. So thank you for that.
James O'Brien, thank you very much.